Welcome to Philosophy 15. I'm Scott Aiken.
I'm Robert Talese.
We are the authors of Why We Argue and How We Should, a guide to political disagreement. Two philosophy professors talking about philosophy, 15 minutes in a span. This is the second of two video casts on ideal and non-ideal theory. Last time we left off with a kind of a challenge from the non-ideal theorist to the ideal theorist about how ought implies can constrains theory in theories of justice and theory working on what justice is supposed to be for us, and that effectively the non-ideal theorist says, look, whenever you posit ideal theories, you strip away so many of the details of what you might say injustices we face in this world. It doesn't look like there's a sort of we can get there from here. And so as a consequence, all the constraints on practical rationality that we think look like they constrain it, ought implies can, it looks like in those sorts of cases, ideal theory runs afoul of it and at the very least posits things that we don't have to do or posits things that are just excessive.
Right. And so there's a stronger and weaker version of the non-idealist deployment of what implies can against the ideal theorist. The weak version is and you were moving between
back and forth from it.
The weak version has it that there's something imprudent about ideal theory. It's stripping away the non-ideal, the grittiness of the world. It's addressing the question of what would a perfectly just society look like. So it's leaving out some crucial details, focusing our attention on some ideal and not sufficiently guiding action, right? That looks like a kind of prudential worry about ought implies can. It's giving us a big ought, but because it didn't start with actual conditions, it can't spit out any cans.
That's the problem of bad advice.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Like, yeah.
That's right. You don't know enough the facts on the ground in order. You tell me what a perfect marriage is like. You don't know, the details about my marriage.
Right.
So there's nothing in your description of a perfect marriage that gives me any advice in how to conduct, my own affairs at home. Good.
Right.
There's a stronger sort of worry about ought implies can that is deployed by the non-idealist, which is the conceptual one, which is to say that because ideal theory begins with some sanitization of existing or ignoring of existing conditions, it produces a normatively, or we might say deontically, incoherent object. Right, which is, or it has no safeguard against, and is prone towards producing a deontic object, a big old ought, what one ought to do, that it's impossible to do, right?
Right.
So the ought implies can, in the stronger sense, is, I think, the more formidable version of the non-ideal theorist complaint, and let me say why I think that the conceptual version is better than the merely prudential. It's open to it. So let's say that a non-ideal theorist says to the ideal theorist, look, you're not going to be able to be action guided. You're not going to be able to give me advice. You're not going to be able to tell me what steps need to be taken in order to further justice in my society, because your conception of justice isn't a conception of justice that's in any obvious way about my society. I think the ideal theorist does well in response to that kind of say, well, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not an
Tell me what the problems are.
I don't know what I don't know what the law says. It's a big complex world out there and the task of making the existing world more just is not plausibly seen as even as a theoretical task. Figure out how to make the world less unjust. It doesn't seem like it's plausible to think that that's a task that falls to a philosopher alone, right? Looks like the philosopher gets to say, yeah, I'm doing part of that task. I'm telling you what the picture is that we should be striving after, how to get there, what kind of advice to give, what kinds of policies to implement. That's just not what a philosopher does, and that's not just what a poli-sci person does. You need a community of inquiry to get that big plan up and running, and to make progress in inquiring into what should we do. And I think the ideal theorist gets to say, and duh, of course it's like that. Of course that's right. So I think the non-idealist...
Come on, it's just philosophy.
Yeah, right. That's right. I think the non-idealist does better with the conceptual worry about ought implies can. Remember, the non-idealist conceptual worry is that ideal theory is in the business of producing a conceptual object that is incoherent. It is an ought that cannot be achieved.
Right.
Okay. You and I have perhaps overlapping heretical thoughts about ought implies can.
Yes.
Because, well, maybe this part isn't the heretical part. Nobody thinks that it's true for every ought that it is defeated by a cannot. There are lots, right? There are lots of things I can't do that nonetheless I'm still under an obligation to do.
Yeah. I ought to pay my bills, but sometimes whenever my bank account's low, I can't pay both my gas bill and my electric bill, and it's not like I can get on the phone with them and say, look, man, ought implies can.
That's right.
I don't have to pay your bills. I can't.
Right. And there might even be cases, more straightforwardly, cases of moral obligation.
Yes.
Where plausibly one is regarded as under several different moral obligations that are not, that it's not possible to satisfy. Right.
Yeah.
They're just incompossibly satisfiable.
Right.
So it looks as if there are all kinds of cases in which we're plenty happy, or at least not totally disturbed or completely disturbed with the thought that there are oughts that one cannot satisfy. And there's a lot of philosophical work that has to go, even in the sort of garden variety, ought implies can, and moral philosophy kinds of thoughts, right? It's a lot of work that has to be done. And what is the exact level of cannottedness?
The modalities of can't. How wide can they go?
That's that are sufficient to defeat even a sort of garden variety moral obligation-y kind of ought.
Right.
It's like, well, certainly it's not enough to defeat an ought that I'm not likely to do something. Right? That's a sense of cannot. There's a sense of can't that's like not likely
hard.
to. It's hard for me to. I don't want to do it.
I really
prefer not.
Me.
It's inconvenient.
Right. Yeah.
It would take an extraordinary amount of concentration and will to get myself to do it. Right. It doesn't seem like we do ourselves any favors by deploying ought implies can in a flat-footed way against the ideal theorist, when it seems to me right to think that there is no flat-footed deployment of ought implies can. Right? It looks like a totally intuitive deontic principle. Well, it's definitely got to be an intuitive, obvious, no-brainer deontic principle for some cases. It's just not clear what those cases are like.
Yeah. And what the relevant sense of can is there, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So there is no sort of easy path from the deontic principle of ought implies can to an anti-ideal theory view.
Right.
It seems to me that, and by the way, it's often presented as if it were just a no-brainer knockdown argument. Ideal theory is incoherent because it violates ought implies can. It is liable to give us a theory of justice that no one can implement.
Right.
That is a conceptual problem. That's how that argument runs. Let me give you the ought implies can worry about non-ideal theory.
Yes.
Because I think that if we think of the non-idealist deployment of ought implies can against the ideal theorist as a kind of inflationary kind of view. It's ideal theory can inflate justice to such a point that we can't implement it. That's a violation of ought implies can. So much the worse for the ideal theorist's inflated conception of justice.
Right.
There's, on the other end, I think, a corresponding worry about deflating or leveling down justice to the point that justice loses a lot of its critical edge. So here's where I think the ideal theorist gets to push back on ought implies can. The ideal theorist gets to say to the non-ideal theorist, wait a minute. So in order for something to be required by justice, it has to be achievable? Okay. Has to be implementable? Okay. Aren't we worried about certain cases in which it looks as if there is an injustice, yet we do not know how to ameliorate it? And we're not sure that there is any intervention that's available to us that would ameliorate it?
So examples of this are...
Well, let me just give one more.
Yeah.
So, do we really want to say, the ideal theorist says, that we're
irrelevant.
Ipso facto not clear whether there's an injustice?
Yeah.
So one sort of example that I raise is sort of discrimination due to implicit bias. We know that there are these unconscious implicit biases. We know that they run according to, in societies like ours, run along types of racist and homophobic and misogynistic stereotypes. We know that making ourselves aware that we are subject to these biases don't dissolve the biases.
Yeah.
We know that the biases exist and are seemingly as every bit as efficacious, even in subjects who are harmed by them. That is, women are no less subject to implicit biases against women than men are. Women and men who are not avowedly misogynistic or sexist are subject to these things. We know that it looks like taking the implicit association tests, which make you aware of the level to which you are vulnerable to these biases, might exacerbate the bias. And coming more aware that you're subject to these things, it seems in some cases it makes it worse. So now,
debiasing has a kind of a boomerang effect.
Now look, what's the non-ideal theorist going to say about this? The ideal theorist says, wait a minute, maybe there's nothing we can do about unjust behavior on the part of people in the grips of an implicit bias. Maybe there's nothing to be done to ameliorate that. Is that a proof that that kind of discrimination is not unjust? That's the wrong answer.
Yeah. So I think that a non-ideal theorist might have an answer back to this. In the exact same way that there was a, hey, I don't need to have a full-blown theory of justice to be able to recognize injustices. Maybe they can say something like, look, I don't need a full-blown theory of can to be able to recognize this. And in this regard, we say, well, look, we just say, look, we think in some possible world that we can, and I don't need to have any more robust metaphysical intuitions than just say something like, wouldn't it be better if we didn't do that, or something like that?
But I think
it looks like the theoretical demand that you're giving to the non-ideal theorist is maybe too much on that.
Well, it's certainly an argument against the stronger versions of non-ideal theory.
Okay, fine.
I think the weaker version of non-ideal theory that you just articulated is consistent with a plausible conception of ideal theory. The ideal theorist is not denying non-ideal theory. The non-ideal theorist is denying ideal theory. Here's the one sentence takeaway of the worry.
Okay.
The non-ideal theorist, in order to maintain his or her stance against ideal theory, looks like he or she's got to commit to a picture of things that's going to have a hard time countenancing the possibility of instances where all of the available moral options are rotten.
Exhaustible. Yeah.
Leaving the conceptual space open for saying everything that's available to us is morally unacceptable. It looks to me like an important region in the space of moral reasons that we ought not to foreclose for theoretical reasons. Thanks, folks.